there's a lot of different types of politicians and a lot of different styles of leadership, but this style of leadership is coming in hot. There's a thermostat of leadership and there's a thermometer. What do I mean by that? If I'm a thermometer, I'm going to reflect the heat in the room. If I'm a thermostat, I'm going to try to bring the heat down. I'm going to try to guide people a certain way. What does that say about our current leadership, though? Are they going to fix anything, or are they just going to chant the anger back to the base that they're getting voted in from? So joining us now is Joshua Green on Open Book. He is a best-selling author. He's the national correspondent for Bloomberg Business Week, and he's written a couple of great books. The most recent one is The Rebels: Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the Struggle for New American Politics. I thought you were going to say they were the axis of evil for American politics, but we'll get into that. You've already written about one polar point of evil in The Devil's Bargain. Nice to be on that. What do you like to be called, Joshua or Josh?
We'll just go with Josh, unless you're angry.
Josh. Yeah. You feel like a Josh, Your mother probably calls you Joshua. Okay,
only when she's mad. Only when she's mad. It's only mom and the book byline. Those are the only times it's Joshua. Right. Every other time it's Josh.
Fair enough, Josh. But you've written two great books. And obviously, before we started the show, I said, what's wrong with you? You don't like moderates? You go from the hard right to the hard left. But in all seriousness, they're chronicling things that are happening in America. And I want to start there. When I finished your book, I said, okay, what's going on in America where we are creating this political extremist, Josh?
To me, the starting point for this book was the 2008 financial crisis and the aftermath. Because I was working here at the time, I was covering politics in both parties, and that's when things broke. That was the real earthquake. And my last book, Devil's Bargain, as you mentioned, was about the rise of the populist right, Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. And I don't think any of that happened without the anger that came in the wake of the financial crisis. But the interesting thing to me was, afterwards, I was spending a lot of time with Elizabeth Warren because I used to be a political columnist for the Boston Globe. And she was, local, well thought of Harvard professor. She was an overseer of the big Wall Street bailout after the 2008 crisis. And so I think that the fallout from that crisis also caused a populist uprising on the left. And we see that in my three characters sort of in succession. First Warren, then Bernie Sanders, and then eventually AOC. So to my way of thinking, and to answer your question about why I'm only writing about these crazy extremists, is I think that set off the extremism, or at least antagonized the extremism in both parties, that goes a long way toward defining and explaining why the state of our politics is what it is today.
Okay, so I have a theory. I'm going to test you on it. You tell me if my theory is a good theory, a bad theory. It's not a theory I fully understood until I got my ass kicked by Donald Trump. Once I got my ass kicked by him, I think I dropped my battle armor to take a look around. So my theory is the political class has abandoned the country. And what I mean by the political class, the moderate political class, the baby boomer political class, the left and the right have both decided, you know what, we're good. We're going to just focus on ourselves. The Republicans bringing corporate tax cuts. The left stopped focusing on the white lower middle class worker that voted for Lyndon Johnson or voted for Franklin Roosevelt. And we're going to do things like pronoun denunciation or transgender bathrooms and things like that. So there's a very, very large group of people that got left out. When the crisis came, those two establishment politicians, they gave whatever money the big corporations and banks wanted. And boy, that really upset a lot of people. And they splintered into those two groups. And I'll just point out one last fact. I think the Bernie Sanders voter was very similar in 2016 to the Donald Trump voter.
Absolutely.
And he got a lot of crossover. So what am I missing, sir? What did I miss?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, to me, the story I tell in The Rebels is sort of how and why the Democratic Party, the Democratic establishment, I think you're referring to, lost touch with its with its historic base of voters, right? Traditionally, Democrats were the party of labor, they were the party of working class, they were the party of FDR, and so on. But I start my book in the Carter White House in 1978, oddly enough, because my argument is that's when the Democratic establishment began to split from the labor class and really line up with Wall Street in a way that Democrats had not in the past. And so you see over the 80s, 90s, the rise of neoliberalism, of new Democrats, of third way, of people like Bill Clinton. And all of a sudden we're living in a world where you can have, chairman of Goldman Sachs can be a Treasury Secretary in a Republican administration. Now he can be a Treasury Secretary in a Democratic administration too. That kind of thing had never happened. So I tell the deep history in the book of how the Democratic Party kind of came under the sway of Wall Street, which I think goes a long way toward explaining why Democrats did such a bad job of putting together a recovery from the '08 crisis. A lot of that money went to Wall Street banks, as you very well know, and a lot of people in the middle class felt like they got left behind. It took 7 years for the country to recover the jobs lost in '08 and '09, and a lot of people were angry about that. And what you saw as a result of that anger was a backlash in American politics on the right and on the left. And Elizabeth Warren, in my narrative, was the first person, because we all remember she was the bailout cop before she was a Democratic senator. She's a Harvard professor whose job was to oversee how the Democratic administration was spending this bailout money. And she went right after Barack Obama and Tim Geithner in a way that no Democrat was willing to do publicly. And it really started a movement that changed the nature of Democratic politics, that split the party from an establishment wing and gave rise to this new left populism wing that I write about in The Rebels.
I guess it was the Consumer Protection Finance Board too, right? She created that whole piece of the government, right?
Yeah, she had a whole theory about what democratic government should be doing that differed from like a Bill Clinton, which said, we're gonna defer to the free market. We're still liberals. We still want to achieve liberal social goals, but we're going to let the market direct the course. Warren was much more of an old style. We want the government to take a firm intervention, not just in the economy, but also in people's lives. And so with the Consumer Protection Bureau, if your mortgage blows up and you lose your house, the government should have been looking out for that. So we're going to take a stronger hand to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. And Anthony, in the wake of the crash, a lot of people were open to that message because they were suffering economically, either because they lost their house, their retirement account, their job, maybe all three. There was a lot of economic anger, and I think Warren and her brand of left populist politics really spoke to that. As did Trump's right-leaning brand.
We see these politicians. There's a lot of different types of politicians and a lot of different styles of leadership, but this style of leadership is coming in hot. This is there's a thermostat of leadership and there's a thermometer. And what do I mean by that? If it's hot in the room and I'm a thermostat, I'm going to reflect the heat in the room. If I'm a if I'm a thermometer, I'm going to reflect the heat in the room. If I'm a thermostat, I'm going to try to bring the heat down. I'm going to try to guide people a certain way. If you read anything about FDR, he was that way. He tried to lead people to understand that they were going to fight a great war against fascism. He tried to lead people to understand, yes, they're fearful, but dial back your fear. We can figure this out. So he was more of a thermostatic leader. These are all thermometers, whether it's Trump, Warren.
Yep.
What does that say about our current leadership, though? Are they going to fix anything, or are they just going to chant the anger back to the base that they're getting voted in from?
Look, I think that the constant in Americans' view of leadership since the '08-09 financial crisis is that it isn't up to the job and that it isn't looking out for ordinary American workers. And so you can see the kind of embryonic form of this in the Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street. But then if you flash forward a couple of years, you also see it beginning in 2015 when Donald Trump comes down the escalator, when after Elizabeth Warren decides not to run for president, Bernie Sanders gets in the race and takes off like almost overnight. The fact that these guys are filling stadiums and really connecting with people on a message, as you point out, not all that different, especially Trump back in 2015, 2016. People forget this. They think it's all about, immigration and Muslims and all that kind of stuff. Trump in that campaign talked as much about Wall Street establishment and bankers and politicians ripping you off as Bernie Sanders did. And so I don't think it's any accident that it kind of activated similar types of people. But, I'm up here in New Hampshire right now talking to voters. Donald Trump is going to romp, going to be the Democratic nominee. And the reason is that people are still angry. People are still angry at the political establishment in both parties. They're angry at Joe Biden. He did what a lot of Democrats wanted him to do, and he got Donald Trump out of the White House. But he hasn't really restored things to people's satisfaction. And so I think as long as that mood of dissatisfaction permeates the country, you're going to have that thermostat pointing toward people like Donald Trump who come in hot, get people riled up, and for better or worse, divide the country because people are just in a really divisive mood when you talk to them on the ground.
Governor DeSantis recently dropped out, and he endorsed Donald Trump almost immediately. Now, Donald Trump had meleeed Governor DeSantis and literally ran a steamroller over his face. It was almost like watching one of the Looney Tune cartoons when we were kids growing up. I mean, just destroyed him. And so, but yet no problem. I'm a total sycophant. He goes into Trump's camp. But he said something that resonated, and it made me think of both of your books. He said that the Republican Party is done with the corporatists. What did he mean by that, Josh?
That Republican, well, part of Trump's power, as we were just talking about, was not just that he's gonna, kick illegal immigrants out of the country. It's that he's going to smite the entire political and financial establishment. So the corporatists would be the people like, right now, that's the name that Trumpers are calling Nikki Haley. People who are there first and foremost to do the bidding of Wall Street banks, wealthy plutocrats, that sort of thing. And by extension, don't have any real interest in helping ordinary workers in the middle class, even though they may pay lip service to it. What voters want is, I hung out with Tim Geithner for about 6 months, like way early on, and I tell the story in The Rebels. But Geithner had a famous line, I know you remember. He said, well, I know people are mad about the financial crisis. I know what they want is what Geithner called Old Testament justice. But I'm not going to give it to that because we want to keep the banks stable. We want to keep markets happy. That's the best path forward. What became clear to me over the last few years is that what people wanted, Geithner was right. They wanted Old Testament justice, and they got it in Donald Trump and Democrats, at least in supporting Bernie Sanders. And I think that still hasn't gone away. So when you talk about corporatists, I think that's Trump and Trump's mini-me knockoff Ron DeSantis trying to make that same point now that they were making back then. And certainly what I see on the ground talking to reporters talking to voters in Iowa, talking to voters in New Hampshire, is that there's still that feeling. I don't think the anger at banks is anything quite like it was in 2009 and in 2010, but there is anger at a kind of broad financial overclass that voters hold responsible for things like inflation, can't get a job like they want, mad that college tuition has gone off, you name it, just the regular kitchen table concern.
Mass exodus of manufacturing.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. The corporatists are the people that cared less about me and more about their own wallets. And so I want to hire somebody that will wreck them.
Yeah. And I think one of the things Biden has done well, no evidence that he's getting any political credit for this, but he's listened to the left-wing populists that I write about when it comes to things like, all right, this time around, we're going to have a more robust response to the economic crash, this time the one that followed COVID. Multiple rounds of stimulus. We're going to forgive student loans. We're going to give all those small business loans. We're really going to try and prop up the middle class. And we're going to pass a ton of money to reshore manufacturing and start to build factories in this country again. I think those are all good impulses for Biden, and they show the influence that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and AOC are having on the Democratic Party, even though none of them is in the White House. But I don't think that it is filtered through yet to the awareness of the average voter. Because if you look at right track, wrong track numbers and Biden's favorability ratings, the economic numbers, as you know, are turning around in a pretty substantial way. And yet Biden is still viewed negatively by 55, 60, 65% of the country.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because the economy is quite good. He's 25 points down just on that one issue, the economy. So I want to, again, out of your book, I'm a little bit of a pundit. I watch and read. Lincoln was failed a few times. Obviously, didn't get elected at the House of Representatives. Harry Truman failed as a haberdasher, had to go bankrupt. Both ended up being pretty good presidents, as judged by history. Here comes Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. She's a bartender. She's wayward, I would say, in her professional career, but then she finds this unbelievable knack for politics. And by the way, I don't necessarily agree with her politically, but I am ridiculously impressed with her work ethic and her political instinct. So tell viewers and listeners something about her that you learned in writing this book.
The thing that struck me the most in writing this book, I, like everybody else in politics, had never heard her name until she knocked off Joe Crowley, who we all expected to be Nancy Pelosi's successor as the next Democratic speaker. And the other thing I knew about AOC was that she came in, even before she was sworn in, occupied Nancy Pelosi's office, which was pretty gutsy and hilarious. You don't see that kind of thing in Washington every day. And that she was viewed as a radical who was going to reshape the Democratic Party. What I learned doing this reporting, though, and I think this gets to your point, is that love her or hate her, she is a very, very talented politician, much more so, I think, than the other members of the squad.
She's an incredibly hard worker.
Incredibly hard worker too, yeah. But if you look at her career, and I tell her story in The Rebels, for the first 6 months, she was out there tweeting at people, live streaming on Instagram, really hitting her Democratic colleagues, threatening to primary them. But she wasn't making any progress in terms of policy. And I think she genuinely cares about liberal and leftist policies. And after 6 months, Nancy Pelosi pulls her into this private meeting, says basically listen, you're not going anywhere until you figure out how this place works. And AOC, to her credit, wound up firing all the radicals on her staff. And since that point has really morphed into a different kind of politician. Mm-hmm. She hasn't turned into a squish or gone centrist, but I think of her almost as like an Elizabeth Warren 2.0. I mean, if you look at her in a hearing, she has that talent, that capacity to be able to make, a banker or a government official at a hearing squirm and kind of create those soundbite moments that go viral. And at the same time, she's figured out how to work with Joe Biden and his administration, who clearly they don't share the same politics. But if you look at, for instance, like her big issue of climate and the Green New Deal, people don't seem to pay attention to this, but Biden passed a $300 billion climate bill that was very much influenced by AOC and her environmentalist cohort. It just wasn't advertised that way. It was part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so I give her credit for figuring out, coming into a new environment, figuring out, protesting and occupying isn't going to get the job done here. What do I need to do to succeed? And going out and figuring out how Congress works, how she can get a piece of what she wants. And that's what she's managed to do. And I think the fact that she didn't decide to challenge Biden for the Democratic primary, because she turns 35 in October. So if she wanted to run as Bernie 2.0, fly that flag, start a big ideological fight in the Democratic Party, she could have done it. Instead, she's figured out, I'm going to start putting pieces of my agenda into place, but I'm going to do it through Joe Biden and the Democrats who are in power. I think that tells you that she's got real political smarts. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 10, 20, 30 years, because she's one of the few Democratic young people that's around.
More impressive than Senator Warren, though. I mean, obviously, Senator Warren has got the fiery rhetoric. She's captured the imagination of some people, but she really hasn't gotten a lot of legislation through, has she, Josh? Or am I wrong?
I think she has. I mean, I think she's a
Okay.
genuinely important historical figure because she came in 2009, even before she was in the Senate, and really kind of built up this populist wing of the Democratic Party that later took off. You can look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which wouldn't exist if it weren't for Warren.
Okay, that's
But I,
true.
but I think more broadly, the way I look at it is Joe Biden was in the White House in 08, 09. They had a fairly small recovery package, and most of it was directed at banks because that's where Democrats thought it should go. Joe Biden is in the White House again in 2020, 2021, in the wake of the COVID crash, and it's entirely different. That money is focused at the middle class, PPP loans, eviction moratorium, student debt forgiveness. Each one of those things was something that Elizabeth Warren wanted the Obama administration to do back in 2009, and they didn't do it. But Joe Biden by then had kind of wised up, and I think the party had evolved in a way where they saw that a lot of her criticisms back then actually made sense. That if you ignore the middle class and the working class, there's going to be a backlash that's going to lead to people like Donald Trump. And so the thing to do is to respond and adjust. And I think the best thing you can say for Biden as a president is that he managed to do that. That if you look at where we are economically, the jobs from the COVID crash, which was deeper than the financial crisis, we got them all back in 2 years instead of 7 years. And today, unemployment is like what it was in the Eisenhower administration. When I meet mad, like I said, I'm up here in New Hampshire. When I'm talking to people on the campaign trail who are mad about the economy, I say, hey, have you checked your 401k lately? And a lot of them will sort of sheepishly be like, yeah, it's doing pretty good now. So things have turned around. And I think a lot of that is credit that owes to Warren, to Bernie, to this wing of the party that rose up and really left mainstream Democrats no choice but to embrace them, certainly on the economic front. Now, in the 2020 primaries, we could see other facets of this: defund the police, decriminalizing border crossings that were not as astute politically and that Americans rejected. And that's why Joe Biden became the nominee, not Warren or not Sanders. But in terms of economics, the Democratic Party has gone a long way toward embracing what my characters began pushing 15 years ago.
Well, look, I mean, you make a persuasive case. I guess you know, probably spent too much of my time as a Republican to really like Elizabeth Warren. I also don't like her stance on crypto. I just think it's ridiculously uninformed. But let's go to your favorite subject. At least I think it's still your favorite subject. That's Uncle Steve Bannon. Okay, do you know why I believe in God, Josh? I ever tell you why?
I don't think we've had this conversation. No, tell me.
Okay, so yeah, well, I mean, if I ever have a shaken faith, I'm a Catholic, but if I ever have a shaken faith, I look to Bannon. Bannon is articulate and he's charismatic, but God made him so ugly, Josh, to save the civilization from Steve Bannon. He's got the contemporary hobo look, the bulbous nose. He's the human walking disaster of fashion. Thank God. I thank God and I believe in God as a result of that complexity to Bannon's personality. So,
And he made him look like a movie villain so everybody could
yeah,
see what was
exactly. I
coming.
mean,
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
a James Bond villain. If he wasn't a James Bond villain, he'd probably be running for president and we'd be dealing with his nonsense. But there's a lot in the book, Devil's Bargain. But you've heard this question before, so I know you're ready to answer it, but I want to pose it anyway. The premise that Bannon or the book is making, that he's really the vessel. Trump is a vessel, and it's Bannon's brain that is driving the operating. Bannon's the software, Trump is the hardware. But I was there. When Bannon joined the race, Steve actually asked me to put a memo together for him, which of course I did. This is before him and I started fighting with each other. But he joined the race in August. Trump had already won the nomination. So do you really think he was that important to Trump's rise?
Yeah, I do. And for two reasons. The first is that, love him or hate him, and regardless of what you think about his
Do you
appearance
love him, Josh?
in his
I sort
50
of
years.
feel like you. I sort of feel like you do love him a little bit. You love
I
him a
love
little
him
bit.
as a narrative character. Remember, my job, I'm a magazine writer, I'm a book author. What we're looking for are larger than life characters. And if you were a fiction writer, you couldn't come up with a Steve Bannon or a Donald Trump. So from a anthropological sense, Yes,
Okay.
no question about it. But I do think that Bannon is important for a couple of reasons, and you probably don't get Trump without him. Number one is, back before anybody had ever heard of him, he was beating the drums for this kind of right-wing populism through Breitbart News and all that kind of stuff at a time when the Republican Party was controlled by the likes of John Boehner and Paul Ryan. And it was clear, especially on issues like immigration and trade, that the base wasn't there. They just didn't have a hero. So Bannon, the first guy Bannon went to, if I remember correctly, was Jeff Sessions to get him to run for president. Not a very charismatic guy. Sessions says no. Bannon went to Lou Dobbs. He didn't want to do it. Eventually, he lands on Trump. Doesn't really think Trump is
He
that
was
serious.
with Cruz prior, though, right? Wasn't he with Cruz a little bit? Or no? Maybe I have that wrong.
No, he wasn't.
Was
Kellyanne was with Cruz. Kellyanne did Cruz a super PAC, but I think Bannon understood how to kind of capture that Trumpist impulse, that kind of populist, right wing, anti-immigrant, anti-Wall Street, anti-globalist sentiment. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is what I write about in Devil's Bargain, is Bannon and his financial backers, the Mercers, had spent years and years and years doing Oppo research on the Clintons. They had an entire foundation. They produced that Clinton Cash book that detailed all the kind of perfidy that her and Bill had done with money. And it came out right as she was about to declare for president and tarnished her in a way that Clinton never recovered from. And remember, back then, it wasn't just limited to kind of like the right-wing ghetto right-wing media. They got this stuff put onto the front page of the New York Times, some of this Clinton Cash reporting. And I think that poisoned Clinton's image for a lot of independents, moderate Republicans who might have voted for, in a way that was ultimately decisive in the election. Because in the end, those people didn't turn out for Hillary Clinton. They either didn't turn out at all or they wound up voting for Donald Trump. And I do think that you have to give Bannon political credit for kind of masterminding a lot of that stuff. And then in the final part of the race, after he took over in August, keeping Trump focused on Hillary Clinton versus Gold Star families and Muslims and some of the wackier stuff that Trump used to kind of veer into. Have I persuaded you?
I lost you there for a sec, Josh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Where'd you lose me?
No, it's good because it's recording on your end, so we're
right. So it's just uploading. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to worry. But I get the point that you're making. Listen, it was an interesting period of time, obviously, in my life. I think that Steve is an incredibly smart guy. He's a gifted guy, but he just sees the world differently than I think we need to see the world as Americans. He literally wants to close and wall off the country and return the country back to 1890, where we were making and manufacturing and consuming in a fairly insular way. We weren't really exporting much or importing much. I'm not sure that's the right answer. The U.S. could probably survive that, but it'll probably put the rest of the world in poverty. And listen, I travel the world. I see the progress that the United States has helped to make around the world. I'm just wondering if that's the right direction. Okay, so we're at the point in the podcast, because I try to limit these things to 30 minutes. I have 5 words, and then I ask the author to please react to those 5 words. You can give me a word, a sentence, a paragraph. Let's start with Bernie Sanders. If I say the words Bernie Sanders, you say what?
Authentic curmudgeon and tribune of working class people.
Yeah, and with a phenomenal Brooklyn accent, though, right? I mean, just the
it only adds to the effect.
It does. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. I want to have bagels and lox every time you open his mouth. All right, let's go to AOC.
Generationally important Democrat, but probably not the future of the Democratic Party.
Okay, so don't see her as president, AOC, then.
I have a hard time doing anything. This is the question everybody asks about her. I could see her running for president. as kind of a factional Bernie type candidate. But I
Mhm.
think she's just viewed as too
Yeah,
radical and too divisive and too
yeah.
scary to too many people
She
to
may
actually
be
win the nomination.
she may be too smart to run for president, though. She may know who she is. We'll see.
Could
All
be.
right, all right. Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Important historical figure whose time I think has mostly passed.
Okay, well, thank God for that. Thank God her time is mostly past. All right, Steve Bannon, well, my fellow hobo in life.
Fascinating freak whose role in history I think still isn't fully written.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. There's a lot coming here. We have a Trump revolution. Trump said something really funny the other day because he is a funny bastard. He said, "You Democrats could have gotten rid of me by now. I mean, I would already be out of office, but you had to interrupt my 4 year." It was very, very funny, actually. Okay.
Yeah.
And all right, so last one because I said five. Donald Trump. Is he the next president, Josh?
You're tough, man. At this point, yes. I mean, you look at polls, you look at Biden's standing, you look at his shakiness. Um, Talking to people on the ground here, definitely an appetite for him. But I do wonder. I mean, the one asterisk I would apply to that is so many people still don't think he's going to be the Republican nominee, which
Mm-hmm.
seems a little silly to guys like me and you that stew in this
Yeah.
stuff all day long. But I
Yeah.
keep meeting these people that don't, and there's going to come a point, and maybe as soon as next week, where the country's going to wake up and realize Donald Trump's a Republican nominee,
Well, I mean,
and
I think
everything
some of
about
the
Donald Trump's going to come pouring back in here. The exhaustiveness, the divisiveness, whether you love it or hate it. I do wonder if people aren't going to be reminded at some point, oh, geez, yeah, another 4 years of this? Maybe
I
not.
think
Maybe I'll hold my nose and vote for Joe Biden and hope he makes it 4 more years. But
I think that some of the country is thinking the Department of Justice may intervene, but we'll see. It's going to be a fun race, Josh. I hope I get a chance to intersect with you over this next eventful 10 or so months.
anytime.
This is the book. It's called The Rebels. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. I wanted you on because I think you understand this stuff about as well as anybody, and people really need, whether they like these three people or dislike them, they need to understand them because they are representing a large swath of the American public. And I appreciate you coming on today and giving me a chance to explain that to some of our viewers and listeners.
Thanks so much. Enjoyed
Thanks
it.
for coming on, brother. Okay, be well. So joining us now on Open Book is Saleha Motion. See that? I'm pretty good at pronouncing names, even though I'm an Italian kid from Long Island. Great to have you on, senior Washington correspondent from Bloomberg. I mean, it's an outstanding book. I have to give you credit for this. I learned so much in this book. The title of the book is Paper Soldiers, How the Weaponization of the Dollar Changed the World Order. Now, years ago, I read a book called Treasury Wars, which, of course, reference in the book. But this is so much better because it's way more detailed about the ramifications of weaponizing the dollar. And so, first off, congratulations on the book. I know that this took a lot of time to write, but why did you pick this as a first topic for a first book?
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for having me on the show. I'm so excited to be here with you. I covered the Treasury Department starting in April 2016, so the tail end of Obama, all the way through Steven Mnuchin and the first half of Janet Yellen. And I continue to keep an eye on economic policy in Washington. And I decided to write this because, one, there is no Treasury Department book out there. There's a lot of autobiographies by some great Treasury secretaries. There are a lot of books on the Fed that touch on Treasury issues. There's a musical about Treasury or about the first Treasury Secretary, Hamilton, but there's no book. And I wanted to show people, tell the world how what Treasury does touches our lives, everyone's lives. And I'll tell you something, Anthony, you were part of the Trump administration briefly, you were close to them. One thing I learned from covering everyone was that we on the right and left coasts forgot about a certain part of America, and that's what Trump heard That's where populism came from. And I kind of decided in November of 2016 that I no longer want to be part of the media that forgets, that allows the creation of a forgotten man. So in the book, a lot of it takes place in Washington, in the Oval Office, at the Treasury Department. But I take readers to Weirton, West Virginia, to Moraine, Ohio. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I talk about how economic policies, currency policy, the dollar policy affects real people everywhere.
So there's a lot to cover. But I read your book, and I want to test a theory on you, and then I want you to respond. And so the United States came out of the Bretton Woods Treaty with the dominant reserve currency. We were controlling the preponderance of the world's GDP. And so we tied it to gold. We then had massive deficit spending, so we had to unclip it from gold and let it trade freely. But it still was let's say, the tallest of all of the short people in the room. And so it stayed as the reserve currency. But we did two things that I want you to respond to. Thing number one is when Nixon went to China, we allowed China to link their currency to our currency. And our currency was being devalued due to deficit spending. And China was beginning manufacturing. So what would have happened from a macroeconomic policy naturally was the Chinese currency would have gone up. But since it was linked to the US dollar, it traded down. So they got a double whammy of exportation as a result of this. And it hollowed out some of the places that you're reporting from. What did I miss?
You hit it on the nose. This development happened over decades, actually. I think that's what you miss, is just the depth of it and how long it took, and how it took a while to take root, and then it took root, and then it took a while for people to notice. And let's unpack this a little bit. I think the story really, yes, it begins with Nixon's trip to China and opening up that relationship. In a lot of ways, I think the story begins with Bob Rubin. He started the strong dollar mantra, which actually underpins and supports globalization, which started sort of after that, right? NAFTA comes in the 90s, 2001, China enters the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The strong dollar policy, and I go into this in depth in the book. There's a chapter called Bob Rubin's bumper sticker. And he created a mantra because he wanted people to get bored of currency policy. Stop asking about the dollar. Stop wondering what's happening. It's boring. So I've got a boring phrase for you to diffuse all the angst and drama around currencies. And it was stating to the world that we want a strong dollar in two ways. Exchange rate wise, sure, but also in terms of dominance. The world runs on dollars. Everybody needs the dollar. And so this underpinned globalization. And so what happened was, everyone kind of people in Washington had a sense that there would be some economic scarring that resulted from globalization. There are people who would lose their jobs as jobs, the manufacturing sector in the US was hollowed out, more manufacturing overseas because it's cheaper to buy goods from Malaysia and Vietnam and China and parts of Latin America than it is from the expensive dollar angle. 9/11 hits. Everyone takes their eye off that ball. A lot of things come into play, and it turns out the economic scarring is exacerbated. Lawmakers and leaders in Washington really thought we can just retrain people who lose their factory job because those jobs were, quote, shipped overseas, go to China. You can't easily retrain a 52-year-old man or woman who has been in a factory floor for half their life at that point. It's not as easy as it sounds. And so those people were kind of ignored. And there were alarm bells, in 2000, 2001, people were saying, both Republicans and Democrats. Senator Max Baucus was really vocal about, hey, let's help the steelmakers. People are upset. Unions were making a lot of noise that the dollar is too strong. It's bad for us. No one was paying attention until in 2015, someone came down a set of golden escalators, and we heard Trump really hear the voices, visit towns that no presidential candidate had really paid attention to, and listen to the stories, visit those areas that had these company towns that had just turned into sad old strip malls because the local economy floundered.
All right, so a lot here. So before I get to that point of the book, and I do want to address it, I just want to put another piece into the jigsaw puzzle, because Rubin was an adherent to pay-as-you-go, which is legislation that was brought forth in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, where there were guardrails placed on the Congress. It's hard to believe, but the Congress actually, in a bipartisan way, passed guardrails to control the deficit. And so Rubin said, let's stick to that, which is why Bill Clinton at that time put in the largest tax increase in U.S. history, at least up until that time in 1993. And Rubin's whole thing was the bond market, right? He said he wanted to come back and be reincarnated as the bond market. And we ran the budget fairly tightly in the 90s. And you know this, some of our viewers and listeners don't, but we ran a budget surplus in the year 2000. We squandered all of that going into these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq without raising taxes. In fact, if anything, Bush 2 cut taxes in March prior to those wars starting in October. So I want to ask you the following question. The taxes get cut, the deficit goes wild, so we have to monetize that, right? Because we can't pay it back with the actual dollars that we bought. But at the same time that we're monetizing the debt, we're weaponizing the dollar, right? And so tell us about that. Tell us about the process of weaponizing the dollar, and give us some examples of the weaponization that took place early on. And then we'll get to the Trump piece and what you're talking about now, which I think is so relevant for the 2024 election.
The weaponization of the dollar, Anthony, started essentially with 9/11. There were some sanctions and economic embargoes before that. The OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which kind of runs the sanctions programs, existed before 9/11. It was considered an orphan of Treasury, according to a former official there. 9/11 hits, and it turns out, the terrorists had to move a lot of money around to physically finance their attack. And it wasn't a lot of money, not even $500,000 in 2001. That money moved around in the U.S. financial system in the light of day in front of everyone to see. $5,000 to $10,000 moved here, SunTrust in Florida, different banks. It was happening right there for someone to catch. Treasury. So George W. Bush's war on terror didn't start with the rolling of a military tank or American soldiers, troops, hitting their boots, hitting the ground somewhere. It started on September 24th, 2001, when George W. Bush, with a stroke of a pen, gave the U.S. Treasury Department the authority to levy big economic sanctions and be able to track the financial footprints of terrorist financing. How did they move the money? Where is the money coming from? And if we can see how the money moves, maybe we can thwart the next plot. And look, the U.S. never had that kind of attack on our homeland ever again like that. And part of the reason is some of the unsung heroes at the U.S. Treasury Department. And since then, it's increased. The U.S. has created even more sophisticated economic sanctions. We got into secondary sanctions with Iran. And I go through a lot of this in the book in chapters that are like the War Office for Treasury, the crystal ball of terror, how money, kind of following the money, tells you where the next problem might be.
Okay. It's very, very helpful, because now we're going to do a fast forward to Davos, Switzerland, January 2018. Mnuchin is there. You write about him in the book. And I believe he says that a weak dollar policy is good for the United States. So this is the anti-Rubin statements that are being made in the 90s. So how do we get there? How do we go from strong dollar is good for the U.S. to weak dollar? And what does that mean for populism?
I love this question, Anthony. You're asking me stuff that no one else is asking. I love it. So the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, I covered him really, really closely for those 4 years. He expanded Trump's existing policy that he had talked about for decades before it was a policy, before he was a real estate tycoon, that a weak dollar is good for some parts of the economy. And Treasury secretaries were kind of afraid to acknowledge this because they thought it would just trigger some massive depreciation in the value of the dollar, because it looks like, oh, the U.S. wants a weak currency. Maybe they're going to intervene in markets to cause it, because they used to do that a lot in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s. They used to meddle a lot. They didn't want to acknowledge it. But Trump, he heard the cries of the manufacturing sector of our country. It was once the backbone of this country, and they suffered. If you have too strong of a dollar, no one wants to buy American goods, not even Americans. If you have a weaker dollar, or at least allow or open the door that if there's a dollar that's weaker because of natural supply and the forces of supply and demand, it's okay, guys. That's what Steven Mnuchin was talking about. And I actually think that freak out in Davos, it wasn't great. A lot of Treasury secretaries have kind of fallen into that trap of misspeaking about the dollar. Steven Mnuchin was not the only one. But I think that investors in the world, allies, finance ministers, missed something there. Had they really thought about what Mnuchin was saying in that moment, they would have just heard what the new policy of the country was going to be, because now Biden has that same policy. He's stuck with a policy that is Buy America, that is friendshoring. So that's America first. That's putting our country and our sectors first. And Janet Yellen, when she came in, she didn't restore the strong dollar policy. Larry Summers, very outspoken former Treasury Secretary, a Democrat, publicly said whoever the next Treasury Secretary is under Biden should restore this dollar policy that he helped create in the 90s. She didn't do it. So Steven Mnuchin told the world basically where we're headed. And instead of really paying attention to everything he said, everyone kind of freaked out on just this one little part about the weak dollar.
So Robert Lighthizer has been on our show about his book on trade. And what you're saying, I think, is very instructive, because the Democrats, and again, I'm not trying to be critical, I'm just trying to be observational, they sort of ignored or left behind the white, blue collar, middle and lower income workers. Like Mr. Trump or dislike him, as you point out in your book, he was a champion for them. And so these policies are actually good for them, and they're starting to feel it in an increase in wages. And so Joe Biden, the Biden administration, keeping these policies has been good for these people. But something else is happening that I want you to discuss, and that is we turned the crank on dollar weaponization at the beginning of the Ukrainian war. So you've got, I get it, we want to have more exports for the U.S., more wage growth for the lower and middle income people, and so we've adjusted our dollar policy. But at the same time that we're doing that, we have turned the screws on people like the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans. And they're doing a pretty good job, are they not, of avoiding the sanctions that we put on. Address that for us, if you don't mind, Saleha.
Yeah, the de-dollarization debate is raging, and we're going to get to a second because Trump waded into it earlier this month when he went on CNBC to talk about it. But not to talk about it, but he raised it himself. So it's the case. You have to look at two types of two definitions for a strong dollar. There's the exchange rate, just by sheer exchange rate, supply and demand forces. We have a dollar that has a high and strong value against other currencies. The second part is, again, like I said earlier, dollar dominance. Everyone needs the dollar. The world runs on dollars. You could be picking cocoa beans in Ghana, and your livelihood, if that's your livelihood, is influenced by the dollar because you need dollars to sell that because you're going to touch the global financial system to ship those cocoa beans somewhere, right? Same with Russian oligarchs, with you name the country. They need to touch the global financial system, and that is the dollar. It's a little bit of a case of like, with one hand, we want a weak dollar because there's benefits, and with the other hand, we want this dollar dominance and power because it protects us. And so when we can kind of use it to export our own foreign policy goals, when we see a country causing all sorts of humanitarian strife, or a land invasion, or disrupting Europe, disrupting NATO, disrupting our allies, we can say, all right, we're going to punish you. You're cut off from the dollar. And it's not as blunt as an instrument as I just described. There are different degrees. There's a spectrum on which sanctions operate, and you can slowly ramp that up and tighten that vise. But that is what the weaponization is. And with Russia, like you said, we reached maybe a tipping point, because we revealed a couple of things. One, that the US was willing to inflict harm on itself for the Ukrainian cause. Americans in the beginning of 2022 saw their gas prices go up, and that is because of economic sanctions. Russia exports a lot of oil. We cut down those purchases. The supply and demand forces made gas prices go up. The other thing that was revealed was that a lot of people thought, and maybe the Biden administration kind of leaned into this thinking, that we do these massive sanctions, we cut the 11th largest economy off, it's a G20 country, they're going to collapse. This war will end because of this. And sure, in the first few months, the ruble dropped 30%. Joe Biden said the ruble is now rubble, but the ruble recovered. The economy is actually expanding. It's expected to expand more than expected, at least according to recent IMF estimates. They moved into a war economy. They're still around. This war is still going. The other thing that we revealed is that maybe we overplayed our hand, and we, the US, maybe sanctions don't have the power we all thought that they did. And I kind of go back to what Hank Paulson once said about a bazooka, where you don't want to actually have to pull out your big weaponry, because maybe people, for all sorts of reasons, but maybe people find out it's not as strong as it is. And maybe that happened with the dollar and with those sanctions.
Really, really well said. Let's go to some of these countries. Saudi Arabia, China, India. Do you see an alternative? Do you see a group of BRIC countries that say no mas to the US dollar, and they create a facility to transact with?
No. Anthony, for me, this book was kind of an act of patriotism myself in a very small way. Look, the US is a strong democracy. That means being self-critical. We are at an incredibly self-critical moment right now. I have hope that we will emerge from this and reinforce rule of law, independent agencies like the Fed and the courts, including the ethics around those courts. We will, continue to have free and fair elections. Hopefully some of this deep partisanship bridges are built at some point so that we are strong internally, because our economy, first of all, we're the world's largest economy. If you look at number 2, 3, and 4, you have to take all of those countries combined to get to where we're at, right? So we're eons ahead in this race. The other countries that you listed, the BRICS plus, they talk a big game about de-dollarization. We're going to move away. First of all, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of de-dollarization. If you want to reduce your exposure, great. You want to trade amongst yourselves for a few things, go for it. What's going to happen when some of these countries that are not based around free and fair elections, everyone's life comes to a close? If their authoritarian leader, succumbs to life, there will be a power vacuum. They're going to take their eye off of de-dollarization. That's the last thing on their list. They're going to have a lot of internal struggles. And that's when their own country is probably going to run toward the dollar. What happens when crisis hits? When another country has a regional crisis, whether it's a couple of currency crises kind of coming together, or there's a coup in the country, political instability, everyone flees for dollars. Emerging markets issue their government debt in dollars because that's what investors trust. And that's what's going to happen as long as the U.S. strengthens itself.
Okay, so let's talk about that because some people are worried, and let me give you some of the things people are worried about. The Bretton Woods Treaty, we had $35 per 1 ounce of gold. Now that's $2,100 per 1 ounce of gold. The purchasing power of the dollar has gone down about 98% in 53 years. Our deficits, some people think are out of control. I'd like to get your take, but we went from George Washington to George Herbert Walker Bush, 7 trillion. Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, 27 trillion. And so we have a $34 trillion budget deficit now, 27 of which manifested itself over the last 15, 16 years. And so is that going to hurt the dollar standing? Is that something we need to be worried about? Or is Dick Cheney right? Deficits don't matter, and we can continue to devalue the dollar to pay off this debt.
That data, the way you presented it, is staggering. I'm going to keep that in my back pocket because it really paints a picture.
But that's honest data, Saleha.
Yep.
Give me the exact facts.
It paints a picture of how scary this actually is. The deficit is definitely a problem. If you consider the U.S. as a bit of an empire, we're a superpower. No one uses the word empire anymore, but I think superpower is kind of this similar concept. If you look at the last couple of empires, or just any of the big ones, Roman Empire, Greek, Britain, they fell. A lot of it had to do with too much debt. Their treasury coffers were empty, and that's not good. I think the debt is going to be a huge problem, but no one in Washington will do anything about it until markets bully Washington. That's how it worked last time, the last couple of times. There have been problems of fiscal policy becoming so imbalanced, right? So if you think about the 90s, there's a chapter in the book called Vigilantes and Control Freaks, and it's all about when bond traders bullied the Clinton administration over the administration's fiscal spending and economic policies, thinking, well, the deficit is going to blow up out of these policies, and we don't think that this is sustainable. So bond traders, messed with the 10-year treasury yield, got the attention of the administration, and the administration, at the time, Bob Rubin was sort of at the center of economic policymaking in Washington, realized that, okay, this is not the way to go. There's not this appetite for our debt, maybe, and markets are going to punish the U.S. economy if we continue this. I talked to Bob Rubin for the book, and he said the deficit problem will not be resolved unless markets bully Washington. That's how the debt ceiling is resolved every time. It's markets that show how terrifying a debt ceiling breach could actually be for the world before lawmakers realize this is a big deal.
Okay, so we're at the point in this podcast where my producer and I, we come up with 5 words. You hear the word and then you react. You can give me a word, a sentence, but the first thing that comes to your head. Ready? I'm going to say the word Reuben. You say what?
Dollar.
All right, strong dollar. Mnuchin.
Stable.
Okay, I agree with that. Yellen.
Fed.
Okay, you hesitated there, though. There's something else you wanted to say. You want to say it?
I hesitated because, and I've written this for Bloomberg News. I've broken some news on this, that the Biden administration has not given a lot of independence and authority to its cabinet officers, and that includes the Treasury Department. I've heard from...
So they've run it as a White House model. If you read Richard Neustad's book about presidential power, there's a cabinet model. Reagan was big on that. Even Clinton was big on that. But the Biden administration is running it as a White House model. Everything's coordinated through the White House. U.S. Treasury.
Money.
What about the U.S. dollar?
Democracy.
Democracy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting. I like that. Okay, well, this book is phenomenal. Are you going to write another one? What are we writing next? What do I
I
have to
don't
look
know.
forward to?
I feel like my family might disown me if I go down another rabbit hole. But you know what I will say is that Swift
I
is
like
interesting.
the color.
Oh, I know. The cover is great, right? My
Color's great.
publishers.
I also like this on the back.
Yeah.
We're shooting the money around the world. I like that.
Yeah, it's been weaponized.
All right. Well, you'll have to tell us when you're writing another book. We have to get you back on. But the title of the book is Paper Soldiers, How the Weaponization of the U.S. Dollar Changed the World Order. Saleha Motion, thank you so much for joining us today on Open Book.
It was a